Well, good morning and happy Easter.
Amen.
Come on, Nathan.
Yeah, it's a lovely sunny day. It's a bit cold. I kind of regret only wearing this jacket, but I survived. But did anyone notice this week just kind of like the hints of spring?
Yes.
I started smelling flowers, and there's bees buzzing in trees and things like that. So yeah, it really is kind of like starting to feel like maybe soon we'll feel some warmth in the world. But yeah, it'll be a couple months still, but just hints. So yeah, as Devon and SJ kind of alluded to, today what we're going to do is we're going to have kind of a longer communion time and a little bit of a shorter message. And both will be punctuated by some sharing from some amazing people. Pip in the first instance, and then Audrey will share at the end. So we're going to start with a parable from Matthew, a parable of Jesus's. It might not be the type of parable you typically think would be read on Easter. But bear with me. We'll kind of, hopefully, it'll make sense by the end. So it's in Matthew 21, verse 33. It's the parable of the tenants. This parable, like many of the parables, goes by various names. I saw even one online. It was the parable of the wicked husbandman. But this is the parable of the tenants in verse 33, and I'm reading from the New English Translation, the NET. But it should be pretty close to if you're reading an IV or something. So it says, listen to another parable. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard. He put a fence around it, dug a pit for its winepress, and built a watchtower. Then he leased it to tenant farmers and went on a journey. When the harvest time was near, he sent his slaves to the tenants to collect his portion of the crop. But the tenants seized his slaves, beat one, killed another, and stoned another. Again, he sent other slaves, more than the first, and they treated them the same way. Finally, he sent his son to them, saying, they will respect my son. But when the tenants saw the son, they said to themselves, this is the heir. Come, let's kill him and get his inheritance. So they seized him, threw him out of the vineyard, and killed him. Now when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those tenants? They said to him, he will utterly destroy those evil men. Then he will lease the vineyard to other tenants who will give him his portion of the harvest. So there's a lot of different angles that you could take approaching this parable. And there's much more than we can unpack in the time that we have. But I thought the best way to sort of approach this today is just, let's talk about who the characters in the story are and what they represent. So we have the landowner, and that's obviously God, or Yahweh. I've been really interested recently in the names that God has given in the Old Testament. And there's Elohim, which is like a title. So it's kind of a general title that's given, means kind of like, mighty one. But Yahweh is like the personal name of God, the name of the personal God of Israel. And so that's the landowner, is Yahweh. And this parable shows him taking care to prepare this vineyard for some tenants. And I think this is reflective of God's desire to bless, and in particular, God's desire to bless the people of Israel. And that's kind of very much the context that Jesus is speaking in. And of course, the tenants are supposed to be the nation of Israel, who are supposed to be the people of God. And in fact, Jesus is very clearly alluding to a story told in Isaiah chapter 5. This imagery of the winepress and the tower and the hedge around the vineyard, that's all directly from Isaiah chapter 5. And so the vineyard, in many respects, is the blessing and the promise that is within the nation of Israel, that's held within the nation of Israel. And God had chosen Israel for this special blessing. In Isaiah chapter 5, verse 7, it says, he waited for justice, but look what he got: disobedience. And so that's the story that Jesus is kind of alluding to and telling in this parable. The servants. So this landowner sends multiple servants, and they're beaten, they're killed, they're stoned. These are the prophets that God sent to the nation of Israel. And what were the prophets doing? They were calling the people back to God so that they could avoid judgment and receive God's blessing. You know, I think sometimes we don't like being told what we ought to do. Anybody relate to that?
Yeah.
If you're doing something and someone points out what you've done wrong, it can be kind of annoying. And I think it can also, like, if you're the person sort of pointing something out, it can be hard to be that messenger. The person telling someone, you know, maybe you ought to do it this way. There's the phrase, don't shoot the messenger. You guys have heard that one? I mean, this is almost literally what these tenants are doing. They're shooting the messenger. They're killing the messenger. They're stoning the messenger. The fact is, it's a blessing when God sends people to correct their ways, to tell them that, you know, ultimately he wants them to avoid the judgment. He wants them to receive the blessing. So God sent these prophets to turn the people back. I think when we don't do what's right, we can miss God's blessing. I think that's the key. It's not so much as someone pointing out and telling us, oh, you're just doing wrong for the sake of just judging us or whatever. But God really wanted his people to be blessed. I'll share personally. Been going through a lot the last 6 months. And that's affected, you know, I've had a lawsuit going on with my firm back in LA. And that's been a very challenging situation to go through. A lot of issues to deal with personally, and I think it's really challenged me in ways that I've not been challenged before. And I really have also, like, not always responded well to the stress and the challenge of it. And that's affected my family, it's affected my wife. So over the last month, we've been able to spend some time with Albert and Angela, and they've been able to sort of help us out and help us work through things. Last week we had a dinner with them, and I was kind of not looking forward to the dinner in a way, because I knew I was going to have to talk to them about some things that were going on in my life that they're probably going to have to tell me some things I needed to change. And in fact, they did give me some input, very gently and in a loving way, but they did tell me things that I needed to do. And honestly, it's a blessing when we have people who love us enough to be honest with us and tell us, you know, here's some things you need to change in your life. And that is one of the biggest blessings of being part of a dynamic community of faith like this, is that we have people who care enough about us to even sort of cross that boundary. You know, ordinarily you just don't want to go up to people and be like, you know, you ought to do this. But we have people who love us enough to do that for us. In Proverbs 29:18, it says, where there is no prophetic vision, the people cast off restraint, but the one who keeps the law, blessed is he. And in the King James Version, it says, where there is no vision, the people perish. And this is really, I think, a really powerful statement of why we need prophets in our lives. But Israel, in this story, consistently rejected the prophets. This starts with Moses. And they rejected Moses' teaching, goes through Elisha, Jeremiah, and just flip through the back pages of the Old Testament, and all the names there, those are all the prophets that Israel rejected. So the other character in here is the Son, the heir. This is Jesus himself, and he's here predicting his death. This is actually after the entry when he rode into Jerusalem on a donkey. And so he's very much, thinking about what's coming next, which is, he's going to die. But he's also connecting himself with a long line of messengers from God. And I think that's one of the key things I want to think about with this parable today, is how Jesus is one of a long line of messengers that God has sent. Why would God keep sending messengers to these people? I mean, if you've ever tried to help someone out, right, and they don't want your help, I mean, at some point, you just say, you know what, fine, you're on your own, good luck. But we don't see God do that. Why? The story of Israel is a story of consistent rejection of Yahweh. I mean, just read the Old Testament, and that's the story that you will see. Jeremiah 31, verse 20 says, "Indeed, the people of Israel are my dear children. They are the children I take delight in. For even though I must often rebuke them, I still remember them with fondness. So I am deeply moved with pity for them, and will surely have compassion on them. I, the Lord, affirm it." I love this phrase, I still remember them with fondness. Remembering in the Hebrew Old Testament, it's kind of like, well, why does God need to remember? Did he forget? But remembering always has this connotation of acting in accordance with what is remembered. In the Genesis narrative of Noah and the flood, it says that God remembered Noah, and he, delivers him and gets him out of the ark. It's not like God forgot, but it's him acting in accordance with what was promised, in accordance with what he had committed to before. And God had committed to the nation of Israel. Regardless of what they did, he had committed to them, and he remembered his promise to them, and he's not going to abandon them. That's God's nature. In Jesus, we see people rejecting God more than ever. So we've seen all these messengers, persecuting prophets, quite bad. Killing God himself, much worse. But Jesus casts himself in this story as the final messenger in a long chain of messengers, all of whom have been rejected. What we celebrate here on Easter, the resurrection of Jesus, puts an accent mark on all of that. Because even after Jesus had been thoroughly rejected, humiliated, treated like the worst criminal, he comes back. I mean, you might think okay, fine, kill the son, that's it, done. But Jesus comes back. Despite all of Israel's rejections, the resurrection shows that God will not let Israel have the last word. In this incredible book called The Four by Peter Leithart, he's a professor at Cambridge, he says, if this were not a gospel, it would be a horror story. Because this God cannot be stopped, cannot be buried. He comes back and back again, even from the grave. So what I want to leave us with before we have Pip's sharing and the communion is that the resurrection shows the relentless love of God. Despite Israel's rejections, he just keeps coming back. Yeah. He will not give up on his people. The final characters in the story are the new tenants. And these are members of a new faithful community that Jesus anticipates. And I want us to think about us being the new tenants. And hopefully we won't reject God's messengers in our lives. But no matter what, God's love for you is just as relentless as it was for the nation of Israel. God will not give up on you. I'm not saying it doesn't matter how we live. It does. If we want God's blessing, we need to live God's way, not our own. But whatever you've done or failed to do, whatever you think is so bad that God would reject you for, that simply will not thwart the relentless love of God. I think Jesus' resurrection shows us that no matter what, God will keep coming back for you. It's just so amazing to hear from people like Pip. I mean, these people are amongst us all the time. We have no idea sometimes the stories that they have to tell. So thank you so much for that. It's amazing, just such a powerful story of God's work in our lives. So for this message, I'll tell you what the title of my message is. It's called "People Don't Rise from the Dead." So I want to start off. We all know the resurrection story, right? I mean, we know the story of Jesus going to, even people who don't go to church often know the story of, Jesus going to the cross and Peter denying him and him being crucified and then he's buried and he's resurrected. But I want to sort of pretend for a moment we don't know how the story turns out. And I want to think about just those couple days when Jesus is in the tomb. I want to put ourselves in that place. I was originally going to have us turn the lights off, but it's so bright in here that it wouldn't really change anything. But I do want us to sort of kind of conjure up images and feelings in our minds as we think about this. What were the disciples thinking? What were they feeling? They'd followed this man for 3 years. He's the most amazing person they'd ever met in their lives. Someone who was such an incredible person that they followed him wherever. They went with him. They did whatever he told them to do. And they believed in him. And now he's dead in a tomb. When something bad happens, your mind churns, right? I shared about the lawsuit that we've been going through, and it didn't turn out very well. We're looking at options of appeal, but right now, things have not turned out well. And my mind has been churning. Right? And you start thinking like, what could I have done differently? How could I have changed this outcome? For me, I had to testify in court. And when I did my testimony, I didn't feel like it went very well. I felt like I should have said this instead of that. I shouldn't have said that. And you just sort of go through the mental gymnastics and think, well, if I would have done that differently, maybe the outcome would be different. And the fact is probably, even if my testimony had been perfect, it wouldn't have changed the outcome. I really think about Peter. Peter denied Jesus 3 times before the rooster crowed. We all know that story. I'm sure that Peter was going through the mental gymnastics in these couple days when Jesus is in the tomb, thinking, maybe if I hadn't denied Jesus, that might have changed something. It's really tough when you're just dealing with something like that. And then add to that, not only is it a bad thing, but it feels so unjust. Again, in this lawsuit, me and my partners feel like this is really unjust. We feel like we had the better case. We felt like the law was on our side, that this judge was just against us from the beginning. Whether that's right or wrong, I don't know, but that's how it feels to us. The disciples are looking at the greatest person they ever knew, someone who was kind, loving, compassionate, helped people, healed people, and he is executed as if he were a criminal. This is a deep, deep injustice to what they're dealing with. And I think they're really wrestling with what's next. People don't rise from the dead. We saw his body. He looked bad. And now he's in the tomb. If you've been a Christian for any period of time, you've probably experienced some miracles in your lives. Mm-hmm. Pip just shared about one incredible miracle. But we've all experienced miracles in our lives, God working through situations that looked impossible, helping us when there seemed like there was no more hope, and suddenly this window opens. You've probably seen him deliver you in circumstances that looked dire. Again, her mother's on the deathbed. It looks dire. She passed away the next day. But God worked in that small window seems to be God's specialty, and these events can be faith-building. Think of the disciples seeing Jesus heal, seeing him cast out demons, do all these amazing things, seeing him walk on water, seeing him calm the storm when they were sure that the boat is going to capsize and we're all going to be dead. But then you face the new challenge, the new thing that comes up. I haven't been through this before, and you think, oh, this time I'm on my own. I don't know if you are like that. I mean, I tend to, I face a new challenge, and even though God has helped me in all these other situations, this one must be different. Maybe God is not going to be here for this one. I'll have to work this out on my own. This had to feel different for the disciples. I mean, we've seen Jesus raise a couple people from the dead. We've seen him heal people, but he's dead now.
Yeah.
This must be different. I think the other thing that I think about these, 2 days is a really long time when you're going through a hard time, right? And they must have really been, I just imagine them in a house together, just sitting there kind of slouched, just, and sometimes muttering things to each other, but really just trying to sort it out. And I find myself in these types of situations oscillating between hope and hopelessness, faithfulness and faithlessness, and I can kind of see them really struggling with that. Someone might say, well, he did say something about coming back, but someone else would be like, oh, it was just metaphor. People don't rise from the dead.
Yeah.
There might have been an Albert amongst them. Albert told me the other day that he's a glass half full person. So there might have been an Albert trying to kind of cheer them up. But it might have fallen on despondent ears. And, Peter's probably off in, a side room and he's just like, leave me alone. I think that what's very clear, regardless of what specific things were going through their minds, the disciples were absolutely floored by Jesus' death. And even the most faithful of them, they did not expect Jesus to come back. And when he did, it transformed their lives forever. And that's what I want to talk about here. Because Jesus did rise. And so we're going to look at 1 Corinthians chapter 15. It's a passage where Paul is talking about the resurrection. And there's two critical points that Paul is making in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. The first is that the resurrection is central. He says it's of first importance. And the second is that he insists that it really happened. And in fact, these two are really connected. Because if the resurrection is so central to our faith, then if it didn't really happen, our faith is useless. So let's read in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 1. And we'll read a little bit here. Paul says, "Now I want to make clear for you, brothers and sisters, the gospel that I preached to you that you received and on which you stand, and by which you are being saved if you hold firmly to the message I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. For I passed on to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as though to one born at the wrong time, he appeared to me also." So what's going on? Paul is talking about, the basic facts, death, burial, resurrection, and then he spends half this passage talking about the appearances of Jesus to people afterwards. There's the theologian N.T. Wright, who, by the way, if you're interested in some defenses and arguments for the historical fact of the resurrection. N.T. Wright's stuff is really good. But he makes a really interesting point about these appearances and sort of like these evidences that we have for the resurrection. And he says, first of all, there's the empty tomb. We know Mary Magdalene and the other women, they went and they found the tomb empty that morning. And the empty tomb by itself wouldn't really give us enough because, grave robbing happens. It definitely happened during that time. And yes, it was under seal and there was a Roman guard there and all that kind of thing. But nevertheless, like if you see an empty tomb, your first sort of inference is not like, oh, he must have raised from the dead. Your first inference is someone like broke in and stole the body or something. So that seems like if we just have the empty tomb, that doesn't tell us enough. If we just have the appearances, in Acts chapter 12, Peter is miraculously released from prison, and he basically goes back home, and he's knocking on the door, and there's the servant woman Rhoda, who she hears Peter's voice outside, and she gets really excited and goes and tells the other disciples, like, oh, Peter's here. And they're like, it's his angel. So in this time, they would have thought maybe if someone just appeared to you, they might have thought, oh, it's just the angel or something like that. And so if it was just appearances, that could also be dismissed, because they would say, well, go look at the tomb. The body is still in there. Like, so you've seen an apparition, a ghost, an angel, something like that. But we have both. We have the empty tomb, and we have the appearances of Jesus. So what Paul is emphasizing by talking about Jesus' appearance is that, guys, this really happened. And he's saying, some of these people, many of these people are still alive. Go talk to them. Go ask them about what they saw. Are all these people crazy? The tomb was empty. Loads of people saw him after he rose. And that's what Paul's insisting on. But people don't rise from the dead. People don't rise from the dead. But let's read on in verse 12. Because Paul is entertaining the idea. He says, maybe this didn't happen, but in verse 12 he says, now if Christ is being preached as raised from the dead, how can some of you say there is no resurrection of the dead? But if there is no resurrection of the dead, then not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is futile and your faith is empty. Also, we are found to be false witnesses about God, because we have testified against God that he raised Christ from the dead, when in reality he did not raise him, if indeed the dead are not raised. For if the dead are not raised, then not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is useless. You are still in your sins. Furthermore, those who have fallen asleep in Christ have also perished. For if only in this life we have hope in Christ, we should be pitied more than anyone. We were talking about like Easter traditions and people talking about Easter eggs and things like that. There's a lot of, it's springtime is coming and Easter is often associated with like kind of renewal and rebirth and hope and all these things. And indeed, the resurrection is metaphorically at times in the New Testament taken to sort of refer to these things like moral renewal and these types of things. But what Paul is saying is that's not good enough. If no one ever rises from the dead, our faith is rubbish. Yeah. And me and all the other apostles were liars and false witnesses. For if only in this life we have hope in Christ, we should be pitied more than anyone. The fact is, the disciples knew that the claim of the resurrection was absurd. They knew it. I mean, it's not like that's like a common thing. Like, people don't rise from the dead. Yeah. They knew that it was an absurd claim. Paul knew it. In Acts chapter 17, he goes to Athens. What's Athens represent? Anybody know?
Philosophy.
Philosophy. All the philosophers are there in Athens, and Paul starts telling them the story of Jesus. And they're like, oh, this is really interesting. Go on, so tell us more. And once he gets to the resurrection, though, they're like, that's a bit much. It says in verse 32 of Acts 17 that they began to scoff. Now, these are probably Stoics and Epicureans who they had a view of the nature of the soul that could not comport the idea of resurrection at all. But, Paul knew that people thought that this claim was absurd. So you might think that Paul would hedge a bit. He'd get kind of cagey when it came to the resurrection thing. But he doesn't. He digs in. He says, this happened, and if it didn't, there is no point to what we're doing right now. What we're doing right now is useless and a waste of time, and we are just pitiful. Let's read on in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 20. Paul says, but now Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. For since death came through a man, the resurrection of the dead also came through a man. For just as in Adam all die, so also in Christ all will be made alive, but each in his own order. Christ the first fruits, then when Christ comes, those who belong to him. Then comes the end, when he hands over the kingdom to God the Father, when he has brought to an end all rule and all authority and power. So this is where I want to kind of bring us to, because I mentioned that the resurrection transformed the lives of the disciples. So I want to sort of unpack this a bit and talk about how I think the resurrection really transformed them in a deeper way that I think I previously thought. Paul is talking here about Christ being like a new Adam. He talks about Adam, being sort of the original man, but Christ is kind of a new Adam. He's the first fruits, it says, of sort of a new creation. The Jewish people, indeed, during the intertestamental period, so kind of the period between Malachi and Matthew, they really developed this view that God was going to resurrect all of his people, and he's going to remake the world. And so this sort of fits into that picture. But here's this one person raised ahead of everyone else. He's the first fruits of this new creation, the new Adam. So Paul began by talking about Christ's appearances. And if you've read these passages, they're kind of weird. Because when the people first approach Jesus, or Jesus first approaches the people, sometimes they don't recognize him. It's like how can you not recognize the guy that you've been hanging out with for 3 years? But perhaps Jesus had the appearance of like the remade world. Perhaps he's had a remade appearance in some way. He's not a ghost. He's not an angel. Remember, Thomas actually pokes his fingers in the wound in his side. So he's definitely an embodied person, but somehow he's different. Somehow he's gone through death, and he's come out the other side. Somehow he is now beyond perhaps the reach of pain, of corruption, of death, and decay. Somehow he's been made different. And I think Paul is trying to make this point that Jesus is something different now. He foretells or foreshadows what is to come, a new creation. And he talks elsewhere about how we will all be made new. So when we think about that, we see Jesus. He was killed. He had to have looked awful when he was put in the tomb. And he comes back in this renewed appearance. Still got the wound in his side and things like that, but he's different in some way. And these disciples have seen this in their lives. Paul is insisting that he appeared to all of these people, and it impacted them in the most profound way. I think one very simplistic thing to say about how Jesus impacted the people and the disciples in resurrection is that before they kind of struggled in their faith, and after they were really strong and firm in their faith. And that's true. Before they were kind of timid and unsure, and afterward we see them in the book of Acts like being very bold and taking beatings for Jesus and things like that. Also true. But I think that there's something even more going on here, because Paul talks about this end where ultimately all the authorities, the powers, the rules will be defeated. And Jesus' rising is this ultimate victory over the authorities and the powers and the rules. He has been killed and crushed by the Roman Empire, the very epitome of rule, authority, and power. Yet he rises from the dead, showing that this authority and rule, they have no power over him. And if not him, not those who belong to him as well. And I think that's the thing that the disciples really took with them, is that Jesus has been victorious over the rules and the powers and the authorities of this world. In the beginning of the book of Matthew, this parable that we read earlier was in the book of Matthew. In the beginning of the book of Matthew, we see Jesus preaching and teaching in the Sermon on the Mount. Things like love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, turn the other cheek, walk the extra mile. When Jesus is arrested, what does Peter do? He draws his sword and he's ready to go to battle to defend Jesus. See, before the resurrection, the disciples still did not get this kernel in the middle of Jesus' teaching. That we're not about the powers of this world. This is not how we conduct our business. Yeah. And Jesus tells them, those who live by the sword die by the sword. It's a different way. I think, fast forward to the first killing of the first martyr in Acts 7 of Stephen. And what are his last words? He says, Lord, do not hold this sin against them. I think the disciples started to get it. They started to get this different way of life, this different way of thinking, a completely different worldview than what they had before the resurrection. The disciples understood the power of the resurrection, that it meant that no rule or authority or power could destroy them. And Christ had overcome the powers, the rules, the authorities, and even death itself. So the resurrection is not simply a metaphor for renewal, a new life. It calls us to an entire remade world. The early disciples were convinced that Jesus literally rose from the dead, and that it was a historical fact that had happened, not some spiritual metaphor, and this transformed their lives in radical ways. And what I want to ask us this morning is, if we really grasp this ourselves, if we really accepted it as a true fact, how might it transform our lives as well?